It begins with silence. It begins with a house half sunken in vines. It begins with the knowledge that something terrible happened here. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The winter of 1834 in Burke County, Georgia was remembered for its stillness. The river froze in the shallows. The oak stood stripped of leaves and smoke curled without movement from the chimneys of the Beaumont estate. Neighbors rarely came by. Even the overseer, Mr. Yates, carried himself like a man who no longer wished to linger on the grounds. The silence, as many later noted, did not feel like peace. It felt like breath being held. By the middle decades of the 19th century, the Beaumont family was already a peculiar name in Burke County. They had arrived from Virginia at the turn of the century, bringing with them little more than a small retinue of enslaved people and an ambitious young matriarch, Margaret Beaumont. Her husband, Elias, was weak of constitution and often bedridden. Margaret, however, possessed a severity and authority that quickly made her the true master of the land. In whispers, townsfolk spoke of her coldness. She did not host dinners or call on other families. She kept her household apart. When she appeared in public at the market in Waynesboro, or once at church, she carried herself like a woman accustomed to control. Tall, angular, with pale eyes that seemed always to measure rather than meet, she frightened more than she charmed. Yet it was not Margaret's demeanor that made the Beaumont estate notorious. It was what emerged in fragments across decades. Journals, testimonies, medical charts, and the memories of those who survived. Together they suggest a program that went far beyond the cruelty expected of that time and place. Margaret's vision, if it can be called that, was not simply the accumulation of wealth through labor. It was something more deliberate, more systematized. She believed in heredity. She believed that bloodlines could be controlled. The first indications appear in the surviving records of 18. In the courthouse archives in Waynesboro, one can find a brief mention. Mrs. Beaumont maintains unorthodox arrangements with her household staff. The phrasing is opaque, but in context it refers to her habit of keeping the enslaved population strictly segregated by age and sex. Neighbors noticed children appearing on the estate in unusual numbers. Infants, light-skinned and sharp-featured, bore resemblance not only to one another but disturbingly to Margaret herself. Rumors circulated. Had Elias fathered these children? Few believed so, given his perpetual confinement and frailty. Instead, speculation turned toward Margaret's two eldest sons, James and Robert. By 1836, both boys were seen less and less in public. Margaret discouraged visits, forbade correspondence, and even when relatives attempted to call, she met them on the porch alone, refusing entry. The house became a closed world. The story might have disappeared entirely, absorbed into the unrecorded tragedies of the South if not for the journal. In 1847, after Margaret's sudden disappearance, an event we will come to in time, several ledgers were found in a locked cabinet in her private chamber. These were later catalogued by a Union officer in 1865, and today survive only in transcription. They contain detailed notes on growth rates, hair color, eye color, stature, and temperament of dozens of children born between 1834 and 18. The notations are clinical, even scientific, but the human reality beneath them is unspeakable. Margaret was breeding people, and not just breeding them, she was doing so with her own sons as progenitors. The earliest entries describe Specimen J and Specimen E boys born in the spring of 18. One is noted as resilient, broad-shouldered, pale irises, another as more delicate, with quick reflex. By 1838, she records offspring from pairing James with subject A. Features satisfactory, reproduction successful. The language is stripped of humanity. There are no names, only letters and numbers, but cross-referencing with birth registers and plantation ledgers reveals that subject A was a young woman of 15, enslaved in the Beaumont household since childhood. As the years advance, the records multiply. Margaret records miscarriages, deformities, illnesses, and deaths alongside surviving children. She observes with fascination when traits from her sons seem to carry through strongly. She charts the frequency of light eyes, the spread of auburn hair, the prominence of cheekbone. To read these journals today is to feel chilled not just by the cruelty, but by the calmness with which it was documented. She believed herself a pioneer. How did the community not intervene? In part because the South in those years was already rife with exploitation and secrecy. One more strange household could be ignored, particularly one overseen by a woman of forceful will and family wealth. When Elias died in 1841, Margaret inherited full control of the estate. Few dared question her, but in the quarters the enslaved population knew the truth. They saw the children born, the strange similarities, the pale eyes gleaming from faces that should not have borne them. They whispered, but whispers carried little power against Margaret's authority. A man named Jonah, later interviewed in the 1880s, recalled, "She kept the girls near the big house. When their bellies grew, we knew what it meant. And the babies, they did not look like the other babies. They looked like her sons. We called them the Beaumont breed." There is one more fragment, perhaps the most haunting, from an 1844 letter written by a visitor, Dr. Silas Corwin, a physician from Savannah. His note, preserved in the state archives, reads, "The lady of the house in Burke County displays a peculiar obsession with matters of inheritance and vitality. She requested of me several anatomical texts and spoke at length of theories of selective pairing. I confess her intensity disturbed me, as did the presence of several children of unusual aspect, who seemed clustered near the house. I will not return." This then is where the trail begins, a plantation set apart, a woman consumed by heredity, sons withdrawn from the world, children bred in secret. By 1847, something would happen to unravel the silence. But before that, the journals establish a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Margaret was building a dynasty of her own design, one not merely of land and crops, but of blood. The silence of that winter, the stillness in the air, was not peace, it was preparation. When examining the Beaumont estate, one must consider not only what Margaret did, but how carefully she concealed it. The secrecy was not absolute. Fragments leaked into the county's memory, often as rumor, occasionally as testimony, and rarely as written record. What survives from the 1830s and 1840s has the character of shadow, incomplete, contradictory, distorted by fear. Yet when pieced together, these shadows form a shape unmistakable in its meaning. The shape is Margaret herself. By 1839, neighbors in Burke County began remarking on the unusual complexion of several children seen at the Beaumont property. An itinerant preacher, Reverend Harlan, recorded in his journal that during a baptism at a nearby plantation, he saw 4 or 5 youngsters of curious resemblance, each with pale skin and eyes of the same strange shade, green-gray like glass. They clustered apart, whispering amongst themselves. I was told they belonged to the Beaumonts, though the matter was delivered with discomfort and a change of subject. It is significant that the preacher does not name them as enslaved children or as heirs, but merely as belonging. That ambiguity encapsulates the whole nature of Margaret's project. Her offspring were both property and progeny, both livestock and lineage. Within the estate's own records, the contradictions grow sharper. The household ledgers list certain infants as issue retained, others as unrecorded stillborn, others with only an initial beside them. Unlike most planters, Margaret did not sell off the majority of these children. She kept them. By 1842 there were over 24 children of varying ages in the quarters, nearly all marked with some connection to her sons. What kind of woman could orchestrate this? Margaret's surviving letters provide clues. Written to her sister in Virginia, they are stiff, formal, and strangely detached from ordinary family life. In a letter dated August 1840, she writes, "I have taken it upon myself to secure a more reliable line of workers, ones not so subject to the unpredictabilities of purchase. By attending to the matter of pairing with deliberate care, I can ensure strength, vigor, and docility where before there was only chance. Elias never understood this necessity, but I see it plainly. There must be continuity if our household is to endure." What strikes the modern reader is her lack of euphemism. She does not veil her intentions. She speaks of breeding human beings with the same pragmatism one might apply to horses. Her sister's reply has not survived, but family lore in Virginia suggests that contact between the two women ceased shortly thereafter. Margaret would not write again to any relative beyond George. The enslaved community at Beaumont bore the greatest witness, though their testimony was rarely recorded. We have, instead, fragments captured later, through interviews in Reconstruction, through deathbed confessions, through whispered accounts passed to children and grandchildren. One consistent detail runs across these recollections: Margaret's obsession with hair and eyes. A woman named Ruth, interviewed by the WPA in 1937, recalled what her grandmother told her. "Mrs. always looked at the baby's eyes first thing. She lift up the lids, say what color they was. If they was green she smile, if they was brown she turn away. She cut pieces of their hair, kept them in bottles in her room. My granny say she got shelves and shelves of bottles, each one marked with a letter." The bottles described by Ruth align with the vials of hair specimens mentioned in later discoveries. These details, though grisly, are not incidental. They show how Margaret conceived of her project, not as motherhood, but as experiment. One of the few white observers to enter the Beaumont home during this period was Dr. Corwin, already mentioned in Part 1. His brief visit in 1844 remains one of the most valuable external sources we have. His diary includes a second, more candid passage, omitted from his letter. The mistress presented me with two lads of about 9 and 10 years. Their complexion was lighter than most, their features sharp, and both bore resemblance to one another to a degree uncommon in children so described as unrelated. She requested I examine their teeth, their posture, and their agility. I performed as asked, though with reluctance, and when I inquired of their parentage, she only smiled and said, "They are of my making." I took my leave with haste. The phrase "they are of my making" echoes like an incantation. It captures Margaret's view of herself as both mother and creator, scientist and sovereign. The question inevitably arises, what of her sons, James and Robert, her chosen instruments? Very little is recorded of their own voices. No letters, no diaries survive. What we know comes indirectly, through mentions in legal documents and the recollections of others. Both boys were described as pale, quiet, rarely seen beyond the estate after. A bill of sale in 1842 refers to Master Robert purchasing medical instruments in Augusta, forceps, lancets, glass jars. James appears in a militia roster in 1837, though he never reported for duty. The journals kept by Margaret, however, are explicit. She notes James's willingness to comply, and Robert's initial hesitation overcome by demonstration of necessity. She records illnesses in both sons, fevers that left them bedridden for weeks. In one entry, chillingly, James faltered in his role, expressing misgiving. I reminded him of duty and of the future of our line. He wept but submitted. Blood must follow blood. Whether the sons were coerced, brainwashed, or complicit, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that their lives were consumed by their mother's design. By the early 1840s, cracks began to show. Several of the children were afflicted with ailments. Margaret herself recorded as malformations, crooked limbs, clouded eyes, fits of trembling. In one particularly stark note from 1843, she writes, "Specimen M, expired, after convulsions lasting 2 hours, brain examined post-mortem, abnormal fluid accumulation observed, cause of failure uncertain." The casual mention of a child's death, followed by anatomical observation, reveals not only the scale of suffering, but Margaret's refusal to see these children as human beings. To her they were trials in a breeding program. Such losses, however, did not halt her work. She continued, year after year, meticulously documenting traits, pairing new subjects, discarding what she deemed failures. Outside the estate, the whispers grew louder. The overseer, Mr. Yates, resigned in 1845, citing irregular domestic practice. A new overseer, Kendrick, replaced him, but letters from his relatives indicate he too found the atmosphere unsettling. One nephew later wrote, "Uncle told me never to go near that place. He said the Beaumont house was cursed, not with spirits but with its own people. He said the children there looked at you with eyes too old for their years, and it made the hair on his neck stand up." The final years before 1847 carry a sense of tightening. Margaret's journals become more obsessive, her entries more frequent. She begins comparing her work to biblical genealogy, referencing the patriarchs of Genesis. Speaking of a chosen seed, she notes her intention to expand the program further, to involve additional pairings, to extend beyond James and Robert if necessary. Yet within the quarters, resistance was fermenting. Survivors would later recall meetings in whispers, plans half-formed, and the recognition that Margaret's rule could not last forever. It is here that the Beaumont story begins to merge with that of those she enslaved, their patience, their endurance, and their eventual decision to act. The house that seemed silent from the outside was on the... By the spring of 1847, Margaret Beaumont was 42 years old. Her sons James and Robert were young men in their 20s, yet their lives remained bound to her design. The children she had produced, her children, their children, numbered more than 30, scattered across the estate in cabins, quarters, and sometimes within the main house itself. The system she had constructed was beginning to outgrow its boundaries. Margaret, however, did not falter. Her journals from this year are among the most fevered. Entry followed entry, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single day. She wrote of successes ripening, of traits stabilizing, of a harvest to endure for generations. She believed herself on the brink of triumph, but those around her felt the strain. One witness, Hope, an enslaved midwife who had delivered many of the children, later recounted to her granddaughter, Margaret had eyes like knives that year. She didn't sleep, always walking, writing, calling for the boy. Every time a baby cried, she came running, not to comfort but to look. She had her bottles, her books, her little scissors. She cut, she measured, she weighed. She wasn't no mother. She was a hawk. Hope's testimony, passed down orally, survives not in the courthouse but in the community's memory. It illustrates a central truth. While Margaret imagined she was conducting controlled breeding, the enslaved community recognized something monstrous, something that blurred the boundaries of family, science, and cruelty. The wider world was not entirely oblivious. In May 1847, Sheriff Wallace of Burke County made a routine visit to the Beaumont property. He had come to deliver notice of unpaid taxes. Margaret had grown negligent in her financial dealings. His report, preserved in county files, contains a strange aside. The children upon the place appeared numerous and peculiar. Several bore the look of kin to the lady herself. I inquired after their fathers, and the mistress only smiled, saying they were well accounted for. The matter struck me as odd, yet I judged it not within my jurisdiction to press further. Wallace's hesitation was typical of white officials in the antebellum South. To confront Margaret directly would have meant challenging not only a woman of property, but the very institution of slavery, whose logic already treated human life as commodity. What Margaret had done was only an extension, albeit grotesque, of what the system itself allowed. Inside the estate, however, the system was collapsing. James had grown increasingly unstable. In one journal entry, Margaret writes, "Jay refused his duty today, citing conscience. I chastised him, reminded him of the divine covenant of blood. He grew pale, trembled, wept, or remained steadfast, though weary." It is difficult to know whether James's resistance was genuine rebellion, or merely the exhaustion of a man broken by years of coerced participation. Either way, his wavering unsettled Margaret. She redoubled her pressure, binding him more tightly to the estate. Robert, too, showed signs of strain. He was seen wandering the fields alone at night, muttering to himself. One field hand later told a Reconstruction interviewer that Master Robert looked like he was seeing ghosts. He kept saying, "We ain't supposed to be here." The enslaved population watched all of this. For years they had borne Margaret's experiments in silence, their voices muffled by fear. But 1847 marked a shift. The children born of the program were old enough to sense their condition. They understood they were both enslaved and something else, bound to the house in ways even they could not nan. Whispers circulated, "She can't keep us forever. She ain't God. Something has to break." A meeting was held in the quarters one humid June night. According to family stories passed down, Hope presided. The gathered men and women debated whether to flee, to resist, or to wait. Some argued that Margaret's obsession would consume her eventually without their intervention. Others warned that waiting meant more children, more suffering. In the end, they chose silence for the moment, but silence with intent. July brought catastrophe. A boy of about 12, one of Margaret's most prized offspring, died suddenly after a fall from a loft. Margaret recorded the event with chilling detachment. Subject and skull fracture. Loss unfortunate but instructive. Examination revealed cranial capacity within expected parameters. To the community, however, the boy's death was not a data point. It was grief, raw and unbearable. Hope later said that this moment turned the tide. "We saw she didn't cry, didn't mourn. She just opened her book and wrote. That's when folks knew she wasn't never gonna stop. Not till somebody stopped her." The decisive night came in late September 1847. Accounts differ, but the broad outline remains consistent. Margaret left the main house after midnight, carrying journals, vials, and bundles of papers. She crossed the yard toward the quarters, intent on some inspection or confrontation. The commotion roused the cabins. Men and women emerged, bleary but alert. They saw her, the mistress, their tormentor, moving toward them in the darkness, clutching the evidence of her crimes. What happened next depends on the telling. Some say a single man struck her down with a tool from the field. Others insist it was a group, acting together, each blow shared so no one bore the weight alone. Still others claim it was Hope herself who stepped forward. Her midwife's hands finally turned against the woman who had perverted motherhood into horror. What is certain is this: Margaret Beaumont never returned to the house. Her journals were found scattered in the mud, pages torn, smudged and smeared, bottles of hair and samples smashed, charts burned in a hastily lit fire. James and Robert reached the quarters minutes later, but their mother was gone. People were running, shouting. The smell of smoke clung to the air. "Where is she?" James demanded. "Gone," Hope told him. "And she ain't coming back." Robert stared, hollow-eyed. James raged, but neither could act. The enslaved stood together, silent, resolute. The choice was clear: pursue vengeance for their mother, or let justice rest. At last, James faltered. Robert turned away. They never spoke of it again. The next morning, Margaret was reported missing. Overseer Kendrick searched the grounds but found nothing. When pressed by officials, He suggested she had fled northward, fearful of rumors of abolitionist raids. The sheriff in Waynesboro accepted the explanation. The record of her disappearance, filed in October 1847, is bland, almost bureaucratic. Mrs. Margaret Beaumont, white female, aged approximately 42, last seen upon her property, presumed absconded. No further inquiry followed, but within Burke County's black community, the truth was never in doubt. Margaret had been killed that night, her body hidden somewhere on the estate's 1,700 acres, whether buried in a field, sunk in a well, or sealed in the old cistern. No one can say. The people who acted ensured her remains would not be found, and in doing so, they erased her as completely as she had sought to erase them. After her disappearance, the estate limped on. James attempted to manage the property, but lacked the will. Robert withdrew into silence. Within months, many of the enslaved fled, some heading toward Augusta, others vanishing into the woods, following whispers of the Underground Railroad. The Beaumont dynasty, which Margaret had sought to build with such ruthless precision, collapsed almost overnight, but the children remained, more than 24, some nearly grown, some still infants, left behind in the wake of her absence. Their fate, fragmentary, tragic, and unresolved, would carry the story of Beaumont into the decades beyond. Thus ended the reign of the woman neighbors would later call the Devil Mistress of Georgia. Her journals, though scattered, were never wholly destroyed. Some fragments survived in trunks, others in courthouse files, others whispered in memory. They bear witness to a project that blurred science, slavery, and sin into something unspeakable. And though her body was never officially recovered, the community carried the certainty she had been struck down, and her secrets buried with her. The year 1847 became the fulcrum, the point at which silence became action, and Margaret Beaumont's ambition turned into her grave. What happened on that September night in 1847 at Beaumont Estate has never been fully reconstructed. The testimonies that survive are contradictory, bent by grief and fear, yet one truth remains firm: Margaret Beaumont vanished, and with her vanished the dark nucleus of a system she had built with such cruel resolve. Her children, James, Robert, Eleanor, Jonathan, and the unnamed dozens born of her breeding program, were left adrift. The enslaved who had endured her for 16 years tasted the first fragile breath of reprieve, though it was not free, and the wider county, long suspicious yet willfully blind, simply accepted her absence as a convenient mystery. The official record, lodged in October 1847, states, Mrs. Margaret Beaumont, mistress of property in Burke County, is reported missing, cause presumed absconded, due to anxieties of the time. The language was careful, designed to close inquiry rather than invite it. To admit that a white mistress might have been struck down by enslaved hands would have threatened the very order on which Burke County depended. Better, far better, to let her absence become rumor, an unexplained vanishing, in a troubled year. But silence in the record did not erase memory. Jonathan, Margaret's eldest, wrote in a small notebook that survives in fragments, I saw the fire in the court. I heard her voice, sharp, then cut short. I ran too late. They told me she was gone, and I knew what they meant. I looked at Robert, and he nodded. We did nothing. God forgive us. We did nothing. His words betray not only knowledge but complicity. The decision to let it rest as Hope had counseled that night. For Jonathan, this silence became his inheritance, one he carried into every year that followed. The enslaved community, meanwhile, understood that their act, whether of resistance, justice, or simple survival, could not be spoken. They shielded one another in silence. No one confessed. No one bragged. No one broke the pact. The children who witnessed that night grew into adulthood under the weight of a secret that could never be shared beyond whispered circles. Hope's line preserved the memory longest. Her granddaughter recalled, they said the devil mistress disappeared, and nobody cried for her. Folks kept on with their lives, planting, birthing, praying. They didn't talk on it because talk was dangerous, but we knew. The years that followed brought upheaval. The 1850s saw the cotton market falter, the soil thin, the estate decay. James attempted to manage the fields but lacked the discipline. Robert withdrew further into himself, haunted, muttering, sometimes refusing even to eat. Overseer, Kendrick, left without Margaret's iron hand, let orders slip. Quarrels multiplied, tools went missing, harvests shrank. By the time war erupted in 1861, Beaumont Estate was already a shadow of itself. The war years accelerated the decline. Federal troops never marched directly through the property, yet rumors of Sherman's approach in 1864 sent fear through Burke County. Margaret's disappearance, once a private wound, was recast as a public convenience. Neighbors whispered that she must have fled years before. Anticipating chaos, her name passed into local legend, half believed, half feared. But inside the estate, Her legacy lived on in flesh. The children of the breeding program numbered 23 by war's end. When Union forces finally reached Burke County in 1865, they discovered these children, confined in the basement of the main house. The official report of Captain Samuel Reynolds describes 23 youths, ranging from infancy to near manhood, pale of skin, with eyes of uncommon hue. They were housed in conditions unsuited even to beasts. Their parentage appears to derive directly from the late mistress and her own sons. The soldiers freed the children, distributing them among freedmen's families in Burke and neighboring counties, yet the stigma clung. Many bore the unmistakable features of the Beaumont line: sharp cheekbones, pale eyes, reddish hair. They carried with them not only the trauma of confinement, but the suspicion of their origin. Some were absorbed into communities, renamed, given work and protection. Others vanished into the records, untraceable. Still others may have perished in the lean years of Reconstruction. The truth of their lives, like their mother's bones, was buried deep. In 1867, Eleanor, the only daughter Margaret had openly claimed, left the estate for Savannah. She worked as a seamstress, later marrying a carpenter. She bore no children, spoke nothing of her past. Her obituary in 1903 mentions only a respectable lady of Savannah, long resident, devoted wife. The silence was deliberate. Jonathan remained longest at the plantation, attempting to salvage its fields with a remnant of freed laborers, but the land itself was exhausted, its reputation stained. By 1869 he abandoned the estate, drifting westward, under an assumed name. He lived in Texas, until his death. Among his meager possessions, was a notebook filled with one repeated phrase in cramped script: "I did not choose this." Robert's fate is less certain. Some say he died in Burke County, his mind broken. Others claim he vanished, traveling south toward Florida. No grave has been found. The estate itself rotted. In 1871, fire consumed much of the main house. Local gossip called it arson. The remaining structures collapsed into ruin. The property was seized for unpaid taxes and sold to a timber company in 1878. Its great trees felled, its soil divided. Yet Margaret returned, not in flesh but in bone. That same year, a well driller working a neighboring parcel struck through into an old cistern. 30 feet below he discovered a skeleton, female perhaps in her 40s. Scraps of dress clung to the remains. A corroded locket lay nearby, containing 2 miniature portraits, a man and a young boy. The coroner of Waynesboro examined the bones. He noted blunt force trauma to the skull. His report concluded only, unknown female, deceased circa 1860s. The body was interred in an unmarked grave. Officialdom did not name her, but the black community knew. This was Margaret. The mistress had been struck down and hidden in the dark earth, her body preserved by the dry cistern, until accident revealed her. Stories continued to surface in fragments. In 1889, a man on his deathbed in Alabama confessed to a minister that he had helped murder his mistress. In Georgia during the war, he gave no names, no place. The confession was written in a parish register, a single line among baptisms and burial. In 1902, Hope's granddaughter published a brief memoir in a church circular. She mentioned the night the devil mistress disappeared, and nobody mourned. No names, no dates, only the phrase, a cipher that preserved truth without exposing. The most damning record emerged in 1923, when a historian sifting through courthouse papers found a letter from Captain Reynolds, the Union officer. In it he described systematic breeding experiments conducted by the late mistress upon enslaved persons, including her own biological offspring. His words, restrained yet horrified, concluded, "Whatever justice befell her, was deserved. I have instructed my men to remain silent." The letter was shelved, then rediscovered in 1954 by a graduate student. She tried to verify the tale, interviewing elderly residents. Most claimed ignorance. One woman, 93 years old, whispered only, "Some things happened that needed to happen. That's all you need to know." And so the mystery of the Beaumont children endures. 23 freed from the basement. Countless others born before, scattered, renamed, unrecorded. Their descendants may live still, carrying Margaret's pale eyes, her sharp bones, her bloodline unknowing, inheritors of a woman who sought to breed a dynasty of her own flesh. Today the land that was Beaumont Estate is fields and pine forest. No marker stands. The house's foundation lies buried in leaves. The old well, once rumored to hold her body, has collapsed into the soil. Yet the story persists, in whispers of Burke County family, in oblique footnotes of academic texts, in the genealogies of people who wonder at the sudden appearance of green eyes, or copper hair, or faces that seem traced from a vanished mistress. It persists because it embodies the cruelest truth of slavery.
Not only the violence but the cold rationalization of violence. Margaret believed she was building a system, securing her name. In the end, she was erased, her memory guarded not by marble but by silence, her body consigned to an unmarked pit, her children scattered like leaves.
The disappearance of Margaret Beaumont in 1847 did not extinguish her presence. It only transmuted it. Her body may have been dragged into the soil, but her papers, the journals, the fragments of charts, the specimens she so obsessively kept survived in pieces. These remnants, scattered across trunks, attics, courthouse basements and private collections, allow us to glimpse the system she thought she was building. It is not pleasant reading. The first surviving notebook, dated 1839-1843, is less a diary than a ledger. On each page she listed names or more often initials, accompanied by measurements: height, weight, cranial circumference, the span of an arm, the width of a pelvis. Beneath these she scribbled small notes: sturdy, pliant, weak lungs, good milk. Sometimes she drew crude diagrams, outlines of a body with arrows marking points of interest. Beside them a second set of figures, ratios, generations, tallies. The word she used most often was issue, not child, not son, not daughter, issue. By 1845 her notes had grown more ambitious. A surviving folio, water-stained and half-burned, contains a heading in bold hand: Program of Perpetual Increase. Beneath it she wrote, "The blood of this house must be made inexhaustible. The lines must fold upon themselves until they can be relied upon as one relies upon seed, which when planted yields true. This is husbandry, nothing more." To Margaret, the human body was livestock. She invoked agricultural terms: stock, yield, propagation, culling. It was language borrowed from breeding manuals, transposed into the register of family. But alongside her cold arithmetic, there are flashes of something darker, obsessive, personal. In one journal from 1846, she notes, "Robert has taken well to his assignment. James faltered. I remind him of duty, of covenant. He weeps, but obedience will cure him." A clinical sentence, yet behind it the image of a son coerced into a mother's scheme. Here the line between system and sin collapsed. Margaret cloaked her compulsion in the garb of science, but it was compulsion nonetheless. The experiments extended beyond conception. Surviving testimonies from the freed community describe infants weighed at birth, their hair cut and saved in glass vials, their teeth counted and recorded. Margaret marked them as if cataloging specimens in a naturalist's cabinet. One woman remembered, "She took that baby right from me before I even held him, put him on a scale, wrote in her book, clipped his hair, kept it in a bottle, said she was recording his line. He wasn't no line, he was my child." The cruelty lay not only in the act itself, but in its precision, its detachment. Margaret was not content merely to exploit. She sought to rationalize exploitation, to dress it in the trappings of study. The pseudo-scientific bent of her work finds echoes in the wider phrenology, physiognomy, and racial science flourished in the 1830s and 40s, offering intellectual cover for slavery. Margaret's journals reveal a woman who read these tracts eagerly. Marginal notes in a copy of Samuel Morton's Crania Americana show her underlining passages about hereditary traits and improvement of stock. Yet she extended these theories beyond their author's intent. She did not merely argue that races differed. She attempted to engineer a closed circle of descent within her own household. Where scientists sketched skulls, she sketched her children. Where they tabulated crania, she tabulated her son's offspring. She believed she was perfecting a lineage. One chilling fragment from 1847 reads, "The eyes, always the eyes pale, almost luminous, a mark of the line. I shall preserve this in all future issue." It is a sentence both clinical and obsessive. She identified traits she deemed desirable, and sought to reproduce them with ruthless persistence. Those traits, the pale green eyes, the sharp cheekbones, the copper hair, are remembered still in the oral histories of Burke County. Descendants whispered of them, signs of a bloodline that refused to vanish. Margaret also kept medical specimens. Reports from the 1870s, when the estate was finally abandoned, describe boxes of preserved tissue, jars labeled with initials, drawers of clipped hair. Many were destroyed in fire. A few entered private hands, surfacing decades later in estate sales. Grim curiosities mislabeled as medical collections. A locket once sold at auction in Augusta contained not portraits, but small curls of hair, each tied with string, labeled with date. The catalog description read simply, "Unusual keepsake, possibly mourning token." The buyer did not know what he held, Her journals also describe interventions that edge into the grotesque. Notes about bloodletting, about exposure to heat or cold, about withholding food to test resilience, infants subjected to crude trials, their reactions charted like data. We know these things not only from her handwriting, but from oral tradition. Hope's family passed down the story of a winter, when Margaret ordered children left outside for hours to measure their fortitude. 2 sickened and died. Margaret wrote in her journal. Subject M. Expired. Conclusion. Delicate stock unsuitable for perpetuation. It is tempting to dismiss her as mad, a solitary aberration, yet to do so is to excuse the soil that nourished her. The institution of slavery already reduced human life to commodity. Margaret merely carried that logic to its extreme. Where other planters bred slaves for profit, she bred them for obsession. Where others tallied cotton bales, she tallied skulls. Her journals are thus both singular and representative, singular in their incestuous fixation, representative in their reduction of persons to the war and emancipation ended the project, but it did not erase it. The children born of her program carried her traits into future generations. Oral histories speak of Beaumont eyes, of the look, of kin you don't speak. Even today, genealogists in Georgia sometimes encounter clusters of families with pale eyes and red hair, appearing suddenly in records of the 1860s. Some trace back to freedmen's households, others vanish into migration westward. Margaret's program failed as a science, but it succeeded in leaving an imprint, a grotesque legacy, disguised as inheritance. The question remains, why did she do it? Her journals offer no final answer. At times she speaks of securing the family. At others she invokes God, claiming a covenant. In one fevered passage she writes, "If the world crumbles, the line will endure. They cannot take this from me. They cannot undo what is sealed in the blood." Perhaps she sought control in a world of uncertainty. Perhaps she sought immortality. Perhaps she was merely consumed by power and delusion. What we know is that she was methodical, relentless, convinced. She transformed a plantation into a laboratory, her sons into instruments, her children into data. And when the people she tormented finally struck her down, they did not only kill a woman, they killed a system of thought that sought to reduce them to experiments. Yet fragments survived, papers, specimens, whispers, enough to remind us that she lived, that she acted, that she left scars in flesh and blood. By the late 1860s, the Beaumont estate lay in decline, its mistress long vanished, its fields exhausted, its overseers scattered, yet silence never fully covered what had happened. Reconstruction brought investigators, missionaries, and northern teachers into Burke County. They asked questions, listened to stories, and sometimes wrote down what they heard. It is from these fragments, church registers, pension files, the diaries of itinerant teachers, that we glimpse the legacy of Margaret Beaumont's program. Each fragment is slight, alone it is anecdote, together, they trace the outlines of a truth too vast and too ugly for the official record. One of the earliest testimonies comes from the Freedmen's Bureau, recorded in Waynesboro, August 1866. A woman named Charity, formerly enslaved at Beaumont, gave this deposition. Mistress kept the children in the cellar. She would not let them play with the others. She said they were special. Sometimes she brought them out, lined them up, measured their heads, wrote in a book. She said they was her own line, her family. I seen my own girl taken down there and never come back. Folks said she was put to the breed. The bureau agent marked her words, incredible, unverified. His report to Washington dismissed them as the exaggerations of an aged woman. Yet the transcript survives, a dry column of ink that preserves Charity's memory when no one believed. Missionary journals too hold traces. In 1868, Miss Lydia Prentice of Boston, working at a freed school in Burke County, noted in her diary, several pupils bear peculiar features, pale eyes, copper hair. Though their mothers are of darkest African complexion, they are shunned even by their fellows. When asked their fathers' names, they lower their eyes and whisper that they are Beaumont children. I inquired further, but was warned not to stir that history. It is deemed curt. Miss Prentice, more inclined to pity than to silence, wrote a letter home in which she described these children as living monuments of a terrible experiment. Her letter was published, lightly edited, in a Boston abolitionist paper. Few in Georgia read, but the words traveled north, where they became part of whispered anti-slavery lore. The oral record among freed people was richer still, though rarely written. Hope's line preserved stories of the night of Margaret's disappearance, the screams, the hurried bury, but they also remembered the years before, the forced pairings, the infants weighed and taken, the vials of hair. Hope's grandson testified to a WPA interviewer in the 1930s.
They say she wanted a race all her own, so she mixed her own boys with the women. Folks knew but couldn't speak. The white folks looked away. When she went missing, nobody looked too hard. The interviewer marked his words with a faint note, local legend, not to be taken as fact, yet the cadence of his memory echoes too closely the surviving journals to Reconstruction also brought litigation. Freed people sought pensions, reparations, wages owed. In one such file, preserved in the National Archives, a man named Isaiah petitioned for recognition of his service in the Union Army. In his affidavit he declared, I was born on the Beaumont place, son to Mistress Beaumont herself, though she never called me such. I know this because she kept me in the house, measured me, said I was her project. She told me once I was her son. I ran at 17 and joined the Fed. I have lived with that knowledge all my life. The pension board ignored this claim, granting his request on other grounds, but the affidavit stands as a rare instance, where a victim of Margaret's breeding system spoke in his own name, his words bound into federal paper. The white community meanwhile practiced silence. Neighbors had long suspected irregularities at the estate. Whispers circulated of children too light-skinned to be fully African, too dark to be fully white. Ministers avoided the topic in some. Courthouse officials buried Margaret's name beneath euphemisms, absconded, vanished, gone to kin. Yet not all was silent. In 1870, Amos Culver, a Methodist minister new to Burke County, wrote to his presiding elder, "The people here live under a pall of unconfessed sin. I have heard tell of a mistress, who bred her own sons with slaves, to multiply issue of her blood. I cannot find her grave, nor hear her name, but I sense the land itself remembers. I beg you, send guidance." The elder's reply advised caution. It is unwise to disturb the settled. Culver ceased writing of it thereafter. In the decades that followed, memory fractured. For freed families, it became a story of survival, of how they endured the cruelty of a mistress, who sought to turn them into experiments. For white families, it became a ghost story, a vanished lady, a cursed estate, an unmarked grave, but the fragments persist. In 1884, a traveling physician, named Dr. William Firth, lectured in Augusta on hereditary degeneracies of the South. In his notes preserved in a medical archive, he referenced the notorious case of a Georgia lady who endeavored to fix certain traits by incestuous propagation. He did not name Margaret, but the location, Burke County, makes the reference plain. By then the tale had entered rumor, a cautionary example whispered in medical societies, as proof of mad heredity. The irony, of course, is that the very pseudo-science Margaret had devoured was now used to pathologize her. Reconstruction ended, but the silence remained. The estate crumbled, its land sold, its house burned, the people scattered. Yet the bloodline walked on, in the faces of children and grandchildren, who bore eyes too pale for the cotton fields. Some tried to hide it, marrying far away, changing names. Others lived openly, though always marked. Local whites called them the cursed one. Freed people, more forgiving, called them the house blood. In both cases, Margaret's program outlived her, embodied not in books or bones, but in living descendants. The final testimony worth noting is the most chill. In 1879, a group of boys exploring the ruins of the Beaumont house discovered a trunk in the cellar. Inside were notebooks, jars, and a bundle of children's shoes, small, worn, some marked with initials. The sheriff ordered the trunk destroyed, fearing scandal. Yet one of the boys, grown to manhood, later described what he saw to his son. It was as if she had kept every piece of them, catalogued them, not children, but specimens. That's when I knew she hadn't just been cruel. She had been trying to make herself a god. The trunk is gone, the shoes too, but the memory lingers, passed as family legend, until at last it surfaced in an interview a century later. Part 6 closes with a realization. Reconstruction brought light into Burke County, but not in. The truth of Margaret Beaumont's experiments remained half buried, whispered in freedmen's cabins, hinted in missionary letters, shrouded in official euphemism. The silence was not only fear, it was also convenient. Better, for both black and white, to bury her with the ruins, than to speak her name aloud. And yet the record persists. Shards, affidavits, diaries, interviews, waiting to be assembled, waiting as we are assembling them now.
The Beaumont estate lay in ruins by the 1870s, yet its shadow lingered. For the people who had lived there, silence was a shield. For outsiders, silence was an invitation. Whispers of Margaret Beaumont's project began to seep into a new kind of archive. Medical journals, academic notes, genealogical curiosities. The language shifted, from atrocity to case study, from crime to inheritance pattern. What had been lived as horror became rephrased as science. One of the first to do this was Dr. Jeremiah Stokes, a physician lecturing in Atlanta. His surviving notes held at Emory University include this passage. In Burke County, Georgia, I examined several families whose features betrayed mixed ancestry of a peculiar kind. These persons bore striking similarity to one another. Green eyes, auburn hair, narrow skulls, yet their genealogical accounts traced only to one plantation mistress and her issue. It appears an attempt at directed breeding was undertaken, with consequences of both vigor and deformity. Stokes never published this, but his private papers circulated among medical colleagues. Some cited him in lectures, referring obliquely to a Georgia lady who sought to fix her own blood. Each retelling softened the brutality, turning Margaret from a sadist into an eccentric experimenter. By the 1890s, the eugenics movement was rising in America. The Beaumont story slipped neatly into its rhetoric. A Boston Society journal, the New England Medical Monthly, ran a piece titled, "Curious Hereditary Lines in the Southern States." It described a plantation mistress of Georgia, mid-19th century, who endeavored to perpetuate her race by incestuous matings with slaves. The article did not name her, it did not mention violence, coercion, or the countless enslaved women forced into her scheme. It simply posed her as an example of applied breeding that had produced a surviving cluster of individuals recognizable today. The horror of lived suffering became, in the northern press, a curiosity, a footnote in the march of pseudoscience. Meanwhile, the people of Burke County remembered differently. Hope's family told the story as warning that a woman with too much power can turn people into cattle. Eleanor, Margaret's daughter, spoke of it only once, to her husband in Savannah. "She made me nothing but a womb, a vessel for her dream. I will never bear a child. Let the line end with me." Her refusal was its own form of resistance, an erasure of Margaret's genetic ambition. But outside her private vow, the broader world found fascination in what the locals wished to bury. In 1901, a conference on heredity in Charleston included a paper titled, "Degeneracy in Isolated Populations of the South." The author, Dr. Charles Withers, pointed to Burke County. There exists a group whose ancestry can be traced to one white progenitrix and numerous enslaved men. The resultant offspring, by incestuous continuation, display unusual cohesion of features across generations. Such a case provides valuable insight into heredity under controlled conditions. Controlled conditions, his phrase for captivity. Even in the scholarly register, Margaret's program was reframed, not as a crime, but as a laboratory. Yet fragments of resistance crept through. In 1908, a letter published in the Atlanta Constitution rebuked the Charleston paper. "Let us not forget that what you call a case study was in truth the suffering of our people. Those children were not specimens, they were prisoners, and their bloodlines today carry wounds no chart can measure." The letter was unsigned, attributed only to a freedman. It was dismissed as sentiment, while the Charleston paper was cited in journals for years afterward. As the 20th century opened, the Beaumont descendants moved outward. Some hid their origins, passing as white in small Georgia towns. Others embraced black communities, marrying into freed families. In both cases, the features lingered: eyes too pale, cheekbones too sharp, hair like rust in the sun, genealogists noted. In 1912, a hobbyist journal, Southern Ancestry Quarterly, printed a diagram labeled The Beaumont Mystery. It traced intermarriages, noting questionable parentage and hereditary peculiarities. Its tone was half gossip, half sigh, yet even this diagram erased the central violence. Margaret's name was absent, only the shapes of marriages remained, as though lines on paper could explain the suffering of bodies. And still the oral tradition endured, darker and more precise. Among black churches in Burke County, older members warned children not to wander near the ruins. "That land remembers. It drinks blood. Don't let it take you." Stories told of cries from the old well on storm nights, of pale-eyed figures walking in the field. These were not scholarly accounts. They were lived memory, refracted through fear and folklore. They carried truths the journals refused, that Margaret's line still walked, still carried her mark, still haunted the county by their very existence. By the 1920s, the eugenics movement reached its height. State legislatures debated sterilization. In academic circles, Margaret Beaumont's case was cited once more. A paper presented at the American Breeders' Association, 1923, referred to a unique historical experiment conducted in Georgia antebellum, demonstrating both the potential and the peril of hereditary manipulation. Again, no names, no acknowledgement of crime, only experiment. The audience applauded. For them, the Beaumont horror was not a warning, it was a model, stripped of blood, fit for theory. And yet resistance continued to surface. In 1925, a black teacher in Savannah, Anna Foster, a distant relative of Eleanor, wrote an unpublished essay. They call it science. I call it rape. They call it experiment. I call it slavery. If the world refuses to name Margaret Beaumont as criminal, then let us name her ourselves. Let us tell the children what she did, so they know their scars are not shame but survival. Her essay remained in manuscript, tucked in church files, unseen until rediscovered decades later. But it reveals the battle of memory. In those years, pseudoscience on one side, testimony on the other. Thus, Part 7 closes. The Beaumont story, no longer confined to Burke County, spread outward into national discourse. It mutated. Atrocity became case study. Memory became pathology. Suffering became pedigree. In the language of science, Margaret was remade, not as a monster but as an object of fascination. And yet, under that layer of ink and diagram, the survivors kept whispering. The truth persisted in quiet voices, in family Bibles, in unmarked graves. The horror was not only what Margaret did, it was how the world, in the decades after, chose to remember her, half in curiosity, half in silence, rarely in truth. The Beaumont estate, though long abandoned, never fully released its hold on Burke County. By the 1870s, vines choked the ruins, the fields grew wild, and timber companies began to strip the land. Yet now and then, the earth returned fragments, bones, bottles, scorched scraps of cloth. Each discovery hinted that Margaret's work had not been erased, only buried. The most notorious of these revelations occurred in 1877, when a team of loggers, felling pine on what had once been the Beaumont North Field, broke through the cover of an old cistern. At its bottom lay a skeleton, remarkably intact, shielded from weather and time by 30 feet of stone. The county coroner, summoned reluctantly, described the remains of a female, middle age, probable white. The skull bore a fracture, a blow from behind. The dress scraps, clinging to the ribs, matched the fashion of the age. In a pocket of dirt nearby was found a locket, its hinge rusted, but intact. Inside, 2 tiny portraits, a man and a boy. The coroner's report concluded blandly, unidentified woman, buried in county ground. But in Burke County's black community, the whispers quickened. They did not need an inscription to know who she was. The woman who had bred her children with the enslaved. The woman who had vanished on a storm-lit night in March 1864. The Lady of Beaumont herself. This was not the only In 1881, children playing in the cellar ruins uncovered a rusted trunk. Inside were notebooks, sealed with leather straps, alongside jars cloudy with formaldehyde. The sheriff, fearful of scandal, ordered the contents destroyed. But not before one curious boy, Thomas Calhoun, glimpsed the pages, charts of bodies, names with lines drawn between them. At the bottom, notes that said Generation 2, Generation 3. The handwriting was tight, cramped, like she was rushed. And the jars, hair, bone, bits of things I wish I never saw. The sheriff burned it all in a pit, yet the boy remembered, and years later told his son, who told it again. A ghost story perhaps, or a record of what we lost when fear preferred fire to preservation. The Union Army had already suspected something, though their reports remained cautious. Captain Samuel Reynolds, entering Burke County in spring 1865, filed a letter, never meant for publication. It surfaced only decades later, in 1923, when a historian unearthed it. In a courthouse basement, we discovered evidence at the Beaumont place of systematic breeding experiments, conducted by the late mistress upon enslaved persons, including her own offspring. Witnesses confirmed, though spoke only obliquely. I judge that whatever justice befell her was deserved. I have instructed my men to speak no further. Here in military ink, lay confirmation of what the oral tradition had carried for 60 years. Margaret Beaumont's program had been seen, named, judged, but official silence buried it once more. The story might have faded entirely,
were it not for the children. In April 1865, Union troops found 23 of them, locked in the Beaumont basement, thin, pale-eyed, feral. They were placed among freed families, in Burke County, scattered for their survival. What became of them remains uncertain. Records show a handful in the 1870 census, folded into households, with no parentage listed. By 1880, they disappear, married, migrated, or perhaps dead, but probability suggests otherwise. Some lived, had children of their own, carried Margaret's blood into the 20th century. A WPA interviewer, in 1937, recorded one descendant's words. "My mama used to say we came from a cursed house. That's why my eyes are this color." She said never tell it, never claim it, or folks won't have you, but I know where I'm from. Even stripped of names, the features remained: green eyes, copper hair, sharp bones, markers of a lineage born in violence, carried forward in silence. In the early 20th century, as eugenics fever gripped America, scholars seized upon the Beaumont case. They stripped it of suffering, recasting it as a 1919 lecture at the University of Virginia referred to the Beaumont line as proof of hereditary persistence across artificially constructed descent. But outside the lecture halls, Burke County's black families remembered differently. For them, the Beaumont line was not data, but danger, kin taken, children lost, lives twisted by a mistress who fancied herself a god. They told their children, do not marry those pale-eyed ones, for they carry the curse. The 1920s brought the final surge of revelation. A graduate student at Georgia State, searching courthouse records, stumbled across Margaret's will, unsigned and unsent. In it she wrote, "The children I have brought forth and ordered into pairing must not be allowed to scatter. They are my future, my legacy. Through them, the Beaumont name will endure, refined, perfected. I know the Lord judges me, but history will see that I have built something lasting." The arrogance of her hand still clings to the page. Even as she felt the walls closing, Margaret believed her project would outlast her body, and perhaps she was right. By the 1940s, Burke County locals spoke of the Beaumont strain as if it were still visible in certain families. A teacher noted students with uncanny eyes, hair too light for the climate. Neighbors whispered that they came from her. No one admitted more, but no one doubted it either. By then, Margaret's name had nearly vanished from official history. Textbooks omitted her. County records grew faint, yet she remained in stories, in faces, in the stubborn persistence of blood. Thus the climax forms: bones from a cistern, notebooks burned, children scattered, features lingering across generations. Each fragment alone might be dismissed. Together, they reveal the scale. Margaret did not simply torment a household. She attempted to reshape a people, to craft a dynasty of her own body. And though she was swallowed by the night in 1864, her ambition walked on in flesh. The earth unearthed her bones. The archives unearthed her bones. The archives unearthed her notes. The children unearthed her legacy by breathing into another century. Beaumont was gone, but Beaumont was everywhere.
By the mid-20th century, the Beaumont story hovered uneasily between folklore and archive. It was a secret everyone seemed to know, yet one few dared to name aloud. The ruins themselves lay silent, just a scatter of brick foundation and the caved mouth of the old cistern. But their silence was deceptive. Every decade or so, some fragment surfaced to drag Margaret's name back into daylight. A bone from the fields, a letter misplaced in courthouse files, a photograph of a child whose features stirred unease. Each piece alone was troubling. Together they formed a pattern, proof that her project had not ended in 1864, but rippled outward through generations. In 1947, a University of Georgia anthropologist, William Erskine, traveled to Burke County to study isolation effects in southern communities. His field notes, later sealed by the university, describe interviews with families who reluctantly admitted to descent from the lady at Beaumont. Erskine observed, several individuals display remarkable phenotypic similarities despite no known relation within 3 or 4 generations. The persistence of pale eyes, russet hair, and distinctive cranial shape strongly suggests a common progenitrix. Oral accounts attribute this to a white mistress who bred children with her own sons and slaves. Such stories, though impossible to verify in full, align with observed traits. Erskine's assistant later recalled that locals warned them, "Don't stir the dead, some things don't sleep." Yet Erskine pressed on, sketching skulls, measuring heads, cataloging features as though human beings were specimens in a cabinet. His report circulated privately among eugenics circles, where it was cited as evidence that directed breeding could persist through generations. None of them cared or admitted the violence that produced it. Meanwhile, the community clung to memory. Families whispered the tale in kitchens and churches, not as science but as warning. Old women hushed children with the phrase, "You bear her eyes, don't forget what that means." The mark of Margaret Beaumont was treated as both curse and proof, evidence of survival, but survival born in chains. In 1953, roadwork along Highway 24 unearthed another horror, a shallow grave containing the skeletons of 5 infants, buried side by side, skulls small as fists. County records filed them as indeterminate remains, likely pre-Civil War, but in Burke County, no one doubted their origin. They belonged to her project, to the children she discarded when they did not meet her design. A preacher in Waynesboro preached that Sunday, "These bones cry from the earth. They say we must remember. They say blood remembers blood." The county tried to silence it, but for a brief season, Margaret's name returned with fury. Through the 1960s and 70s, a strange tension emerged. On the one hand, scholars of Southern history began to unearth fragments of the Beaumont record. On the other, descendants scattered across Georgia and beyond struggled to live under the shadow of wisp. One woman, interviewed in 1974, said simply, "When people look too long at my eyes, I know they know, I carry her, whether I want to or not." The curse was not only genetic, it was social, a stigma, a silence, a history pressed into bone. By the late 20th century, with DNA science rising, genealogists returned to the Beaumont story. In 1992, a private researcher traced several Burke County families back to a common matriarch, noting the likelihood of incestuous consolidation across generations. The report was never published, but copies circulated online in early genealogy forums, where whispers of the Beaumont strain mingled with myth. It was around this time that the tale crossed into internet folklore. Early message boards in the late 1990s carried threads titled "The Lady of Beaumont" or "George's Inbred Dynasty." Posters claimed sightings of pale-eyed descendants, of uncanny resemblances across unrelated towns. Some told of travelers who encountered families too similar, as though stamped from one mold. The line between archive and creepypasta blurred. In 2003, construction workers near Waynesboro stumbled upon a sealed brick vault beneath a demolished outbuilding. Inside were glass jars, clouded but intact, containing preserved tissues. Some held tufts of auburn hair, others fragments of bone in alcohol, and in the bottom, a notebook bumped in oilcloth. Though damaged, its entries could still be read. March, Subject 12, promising cranial form, continue pairing with Subject 7. July 1861, Generation 3, yields improved eyes yet the skull elongates, correction required. December 1863, war closes upon us. I will not abandon the work. If the house falls, bury the specimens. The sheriff sealed the vault, citing health concerns. The notebook vanished into county archives, inaccessible to the public, but copies of the entries leaked. For the first time, Margaret's own words reached beyond Burke County. Her voice was clinical, children reduced to subjects, lineage treated as stock. It confirmed what rumor had carried for more than a century. This was no accident, no exaggeration, it was deliberate design. The notebook's leak sparked both fascination and dread. Academic conferences discussed it as a rare primary source in the study of hereditary practices. Online forums spun it into ghost story. In Burke County itself, older residents wept. For them it was not abstract. It was the memory of mothers forced, of children marked, of graves unmarked in fields. One elder put it plainly in 2005, "You outsiders see her as curiosity. We live with her still. She walks in our blood. You cannot archive that away." By the 2010s, with consumer DNA tests booming, whispers of the Beaumont line returned with urgency. Burke County descendants logged into genealogy databases and found dozens of close matches, faces they did not know, scattered across Georgia, South Carolina, Florida. Strangers who looked like kin, strangers who carried the same pale eyes. Online forums lit up. The Beaumont cluster is real. They're all over the Southeast. But no one could speak too loudly. To claim it was to admit descent from a horror. Some denied it, some embraced, most stayed silent, as their ancestors had before. And yet the story refuses to stay buried. Margaret Beaumont's ambition to birth a legacy that outlived her succeeded in the cruelest way. Though her body lies broken in an unmarked grave, her blood still walks in courthouse files, in jars beneath the earth, in the eyes of children who do not yet know why strangers stare at them. This is the revelation. Margaret did not end in 1864. She did not end in 1947. She did not end at all. Her project persists, not as dynasty, but as curse. Today the site of Beaumont Estate is easy to miss. Drive along the narrow county road just south of Waynesboro and you'll pass farmland, pine stands and scrub oak. The fields are silent, the air heavy in summer, and nothing suggests that beneath the soil lie unmarked graves, shattered jars and the last stones of a house where cruelty was once systematized into ritual. No sign tells visitors what happened there. No marker commemorates the enslaved who suffered within its walls. And yet for those who know where to look, the past presses close. A half-collapsed foundation still juts through the earth, vines curling over brick blackened by fire. The mouth of the cistern, long filled with mud and leaves, sags inward like a wound. Some nights, locals say, the air around it chills even in July, but the silence is deceptive. Beaumont's legacy lingers not in stone, but in blood, memory, and unease. The final fragments. In 2017, during a survey for a proposed solar farm, archaeologists re-examining the property uncovered a scatter of buttons, iron shackles and the burned rim of a child's shoe. The discovery made regional news for a few days, but deeper excavations were quietly abandoned. An internal memo later leaked, warned, this site is contaminated not merely with artifacts but with reputation. If exhumed, it could destabilize the community, provoke lawsuits, and reignite painful histories, best left unexamined. Once again silence prevailed, and yet, silence cannot contain the story, not when fragments keep surfacing. A cousin's DNA match, an attic trunk with letters, a rumor passed in church basements. The dead refuse to stay hid. Descendants in the present. In Burke County today there are families who bear Margaret Beaumont's legacy without choosing it. Some know and keep quiet, some deny, some wear it openly, acknowledging a history too heavy to erase. One woman, interviewed anonymously in 2020 said, "When my son was born, the nurse said, his eyes are the color of moss, so unusual, so striking, and all I could think was, she's still here, she still touches us. I don't want her in my baby, I want him free of." But blood remembers, whether we like it or not. For many, the inheritance is not only genetic, it is psychological. To learn that your line descends from both enslaved and enslaver, from victim and perpetrator, from incest forced in the name of breeding, what does a person do with that? For some, it becomes silence. For others, anger. For others still, a strange kind of defiance. Survival itself as resistance. The persistence of oral memory. In Burke County's black community, the Beaumont story remains alive not because of archives, but because of oral tradition. Elders tell it obliquely in whispers, framing it as both history and warning. Don't think cruelty ended when the chains broke, one man told a researcher. It changes shape, but it lingers. Beaumont is proof. At family reunions, old women still mutter about the curse of the eye. Children learn to interpret silence as much as words. To outsiders, these fragments sound like folklore. To those who carry them, they are truth wrapped in protection, secrets in the soil. And then there are the unmarked graves. Estimates vary wildly. Some say dozens, others hundreds. The county cemetery holds no records. The enslaved buried their own at night in fields, in woods, in hollows, no map records. A hunter in 2019 stumbled across bones near the edge of a creek bed. The jawline of a child no more than 4 years. The sheriff's office dismissed it as likely pre-Civil War remains. No foul play suspected. But locals knew, always they knew. The earth here does not forget. The question of justice. So what becomes of Margaret Beaumont in memory? Official records call her a missing person. Some genealogists describe her clinically. Planter's widow, vanished circa 1864. Academic papers hedge with words like alleged or unverified. But within Burke County's black community there is no doubt. She was killed by those she enslaved. She was buried in a